We know from Reuters, for example, that Tehran warned him about it, about the possible attack, and other agencies. But actually, I think this terrorist attack was rather like blessing for Putin. He was really happy that it actually happened in Russia. So now he can blame Ukraine. He can demonize the Western world, and this gives him opportunity to launch, for example, another wave of mobilization. Advisor for the Ministry of Interior, he's a Russian Major General, actually. He said that this attack was performed by the terrorists that had microchips installed in their brain, and they were psychologically programmed to do that. This is crazy.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're once again talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, Operator Starsky, Ukrainian veteran, YouTuber and co-founder of the Propaganda Study Institute. Operator Starsky, welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Wanted to start just by talking about what we've seen in Ukrainian cities, in particular in Kyiv and in Kharkiv in recent weeks. You know, a persistent attack by the Russians in terms of missiles and drones on key bits of infrastructure, in particular energy infrastructure. How would you say Ukraine's air defences are holding up against that?
So we're doing our best. The problem is, of course, the lack of anti-air missiles. That is something that we can feel, unfortunately, and we all anticipate more missiles to be brought to Ukraine to be able to defend against the Russian missiles more efficiently. We can see that Russians started using their new Zircon missiles. They're like old missiles but modified, so they have increased range. They're also hypersonic missiles, just like Russian X-47 Kinzhals, and apparently they're even better, technically speaking, than Kinzhals. But we're doing the best we can. This is the beginning of the year 2024. More than 180 different types of missiles and drones were launched at Kyiv specifically. Approximately 1,000 different types of ammunition, like missiles and drones, were launched all over Ukrainian cities. We can see that there were a lot of strikes on energy infrastructure in Dnipro, in Zaporizhia, in Khmelnytsky, Lviv Oblast, and Kyiv, of course.
And what has been the impact in terms of the damage sustained to energy infrastructure? I know there have been some blackouts in Kharkiv, for example.
There were blackouts in Kharkiv, in Dnipro, in Poltava. Unfortunately, we have a lot of blackouts on the western Ukraine as well, western oblasts. Like Lviv, Rivne, Zhytomyr, and currently we are trying to modify our energy grid. So, according to our Minister of Energy of Ukraine, we have several big power plants that are basically good targets for the Russian missiles, but we want to turn it into a lot, like hundreds of smaller targets that will be much harder to hit by the Russian missiles.
And how would you assess the strength of the Ukrainian air defense umbrella at the moment? I mean, you mentioned that, you know, really you need extra air defense systems, and that's a massive issue. But, you know, at the moment, it feels like Ukraine's air defences have been remarkably successful in the 2+ years of the conflict so far, or since the full-scale invasion. But how would you assess that capability currently?
So I think at this point it's probably one of the strongest types of air defense that we have in Europe right now. But unfortunately, it's not enough. It's not enough because there's 25 oblasts in Ukraine. 22 of them are currently being under Ukrainian control, controlled by our government, which means that we need at least 20 more systems such as Patriot systems. Those proved to be very efficient in intercepting Russian hypersonic missiles. Currently, we don't have. We need 10 times more, roughly speaking, in order to cover all Ukraine, in order to be able to defend our citizens and our energy infrastructure, civilian infrastructure against Russian weapons. It's something that people in the Europe and on the West in general must understand, that two, three, four Patriots, they will not change picture much, because one way or another Russians are shooting like 50 missiles, knowing that at least 5 of them will hit the target. And this is what we see today. And we need, roughly speaking, 10 times more of those Patriot systems to be able to protect against Russian long-range weapons.
It's a really good point. I mean, we did have some good news over the weekend. France announced on Sunday they're going to provide an unspecified number of Aster-30 surface-to-air missiles to Ukraine. Obviously, we don't know specifically how many there are, but what do you make of that? And also tying in with the fact that we've had in recent months President Macron sort of reaffirming his commitment to Ukraine.
Yeah, and it was a very good sign, in my opinion. Again, it's very important for the European leaders to show over and over again, and to speak about it over and over again, that they support Ukraine, that they keep providing us with necessary military and humanitarian supplies, because Russian misinformation is very strong. They're doing all they can to convince Ukrainians on the first place that the West abandoned Ukraine, that everybody's tired of war, and things like that. It's very important to keep talking about this, because this is the biggest conflict in the heart of Europe since 1945, and we cannot just abandon this. We have to keep talking about it.
Just to pick up on what you said there about the scale of Russian disinformation targeted at Ukrainians at the moment, just give me some examples if you can. What exactly are they doing?
Speaking about the most recent informational attacks, we can say that Russians keep trying to blame Ukraine for organizing the ISIS terrorist attack in Moscow. So they keep blaming Ukraine, the UK, and the US. Like, people must understand that this is something hilarious and incredible at the same time. Russian professor and political scientist that is a big friend and supporter of Vladimir Putin last week stated that Ukrainians used humanoid drones programmed to hit civilians in the Crocus City Hall in Moscow. Then several days ago, Russian former chief for the Russian Interpol and his advisor for the Ministry of Interior, he's a Russian major general, actually. He said that this attack was performed by the terrorists that had microchips installed in their brain, and they were psychologically programmed to do that. This is crazy. Worst thing that people in Russia specifically, they believe this misinformation, because Russians involve all kinds of speakers, and those people are of a pretty high level. They're like PhD, they're doctors, they're former authorities of the top level, and they spread this absolutely ridiculous misinformation that people in Russia keep consuming. It's crazy.
It is interesting, though, that it could be a moment of danger for Vladimir Putin internally, because he's there dismissing the threat posed, the very real threat posed by ISIS-K to Russia, and instead trying to baselessly claim that somehow Ukraine were involved, when his intelligence services are telling him, no, there's a genuine threat from ISIS-K. And if there is a kind of division between the Russian intelligence services and Vladimir Putin, long term, that could be very dangerous for him.
I would say that it's a bit opposite. Even though he was warned, by the way, by Iran, we know from Reuters, for example, that Tehran warned him about it, about the possible attack, and other agencies. But actually, I think this terrorist attack was rather like blessing for Putin. He was really happy that it actually happened in Russia. So now he can blame Ukraine. He can demonize the Western world, and this gives him opportunity to launch, for example, another wave of mobilization. Recently, Russians photoshopped, those postmarks that we had. We had a postmark of a Ukrainian soldier showing a finger to the Russian warship and things like that. And they did something very similar with burning Crocus Hall. And basically, they tried to blame Ukraine, and they tried to say that Ukrainians posted those postmarks to celebrate the terrorist attack in Moscow. So we see that this misinformation has some kind of goal that they're trying to reach. And in my opinion, because according to military culture, nothing happens just because. Everything happens for a reason, and everything has some kind of goal. And in my opinion, this goal is to further demonize Ukrainians in the eyes of Russians, because we don't give them enough reasons to do that. We don't strike Russian civilians deliberately. We don't strike Russian residential buildings. We don't torture their prisoners of war, and we don't do all those things that Russians do to Ukrainians. That's why they keep demonizing us. And apparently, I think one of the goals is opportunity to launch a new mobilization.
So Putin's almost using the Crocus City Hall attacks as a kind of false flag operation, not to suggest that Russia somehow staged that. I'm not saying that, but in terms of how he's spun it to justify his campaign against Ukraine. Something else you mentioned, Operator Starsky, a moment ago was the way that Russia is trying to undermine the messaging among Ukrainians, so that Ukrainians feel somehow they're being abandoned by the West. And of course, there are legitimate concerns about, for example, the lack of renewed military aid from the US Congress. So there would be understandable grievances, I suppose, from Ukrainians. But just talk to me a bit about some of the tactics that Putin is using there to try and undermine the solidarity there is between the West and Ukraine.
So they're constantly bombarding Ukrainian society through Telegram channels, for example, through different so-called independent media, with messages that, for example, Europe is trying to find a solution to force Ukraine to negotiate with Putin. And basically, they're trying to say that the Western countries like Germany, like France, which are some of our strongest allies, like the UK, by the way, they're trying to convince Ukraine to capitulate. And this is something that we heard back in 2022, but these days this information is absolutely massive. According to German authorities, for example, the Russian misinformation on Ukraine and on the Western countries grew several times comparing to the last year.
You mentioned a moment ago how Putin is using the attacks the other week to justify a fresh wave of mobilization. We've seen that now. He signed a decree authorizing a spring military conscription, which will draft around 150,000 Russians between April and July. We've spoken a lot before on Frontline about the very high Russian casualty rate. But I mean, how big a worry is it that even though the casualty rate for Russia is enormously high, they can sustain it, it would seem at the moment, because Putin doesn't care about Russian casualties?
This is their usual tactic. Basically, they know that they have never-ending source of human material, right? Of personnel that they can literally throw into meat assaults. And this is their tactics. It's ridiculous from the European standpoint. We don't fight like that. we don't just sacrifice our soldiers in such amounts. But to Russia, it is and it was their common culture of combat, common doctrine. And they know that they can compensate whatever losses they have because they have huge population, and of course they have huge stockpile of ammunition and vehicles. This is again something very concerning because, for example, there was estimation that the UK doesn't have enough artillery to fight against Russia if Russia invades, for example, the United Kingdom. Russians have such resources because they were stockpiling artillery shells for decades since the World War II. During the Cold War, they grew their storage, their arsenal of weapons, because we know that they were selling them, they were giving them to other countries during the Cold War and in the 90s as well. So unfortunately, they have this opportunity. Again, if we take a look at annual GDP, Russia has smaller annual GDP than Italy, for example. And the sizes of those territories cannot be compared. But at the same time, this is a good answer to the question why people in Italy live in better conditions than people in Russia, where 2/3 of people of population live in absolute poverty. This is because they have different strategies. Italy has social policies and things like that. Russia is stockpiling weapons like crazy since 1945. That's the only answer to this.
Where are we with fresh waves of mobilization in Ukraine? I know President Zelensky said just before Christmas that he felt it might need to be up to 500,000 more troops mobilized by Ukraine. Where are we with that? What's the latest?
So the latest news that we have is that the mobilization law is already almost complete, like 90% complete, and there will be a lot of changes introduced to the initial project of this legislation because there were a lot of things that must have been changed to make sure that this law corresponds to human rights and things like that. So there were a lot of consultations with different experts and committees of the Ukrainian parliament regarding this. And we will see this law, I think, adopted maybe this month already. Again, the problem, like the global problem in Ukraine regarding the mobilization and regarding the troops, is that our personnel is fighting for more than 2 years already non-stop. Our soldiers have opportunity to take a vacation, for example, for like 30 days, see their families, but still those people keep fighting, and if we don't change them, we don't know how much time this war takes, maybe years, maybe a decade, and those guys must be replaced. They must take some rest, and they must be replaced. So this is the current situation.
And is that something you pick up from your conversations with former colleagues, that there is combat fatigue, understandably, because we're more than 2 years into this conflict now?
Yes, and those guys that keep fighting for almost 2 years, we can understand them. Russians generally die. Russians have a lot of fresh troops because they have to constantly replace their losses. For example, today I think I didn't check the statistics yet, but I think that we will have the biggest number of Russian vehicles destroyed since the beginning of the invasion in different parts of Ukraine. Yesterday, we already counted something like 60 vehicles that were eliminated, judging from the OSINT, from videos that we had. Russians keep bringing fresh troops. They don't have fighting fatigue because they die. They don't live that long. Our guys, unfortunately, they keep feeling tired, but they keep fighting because there's nowhere for us to run.
I suppose one of the other big challenges with fresh waves of mobilization of Ukrainian troops is the supplies. It comes down to you can have extra men on the front line fighting, but if you haven't got the equipment, if you haven't got fresh military aid and weaponry to support them, that's going to present huge operational challenges.
Absolutely, it's a combined forces doctrine. We have to have vehicles. Again, this is another reason why, for example, Russia's claims that they can bring like 1 million troops to Ukraine doesn't make sense, because troops without vehicles, without proper supplies, they don't work. When the day Russia brings 1 million troops to Ukraine and concentrate them in the same location will be the happiest day for the Ukrainian artillery operators. So you have to have vehicles, you have to have proper supplies, you have to have good logistics in order to be able to mobilize that many soldiers. And again, we are talking about the supplies from our Western allies.
Just want to bring you back to what we were discussing a bit earlier on, President Macron's recent comments where he suggested that NATO troops or troops from NATO countries, maybe is a better way of putting it, might be used in Ukraine, if not on the front line itself, then certainly in more of a training capacity. I mean, it probably happens already to a large extent, but in a more developed way to what we've seen so far. What did you make of those comments?
Well, if we're talking about the Russian reaction to this, for example, they don't care much about the words, they care more about the actions. And if we're talking about the perspective, I think it is there is currently a choice for the European nations and Western nations in general. Will they fight Russia in Ukraine, or will they fight Russia in France, Estonia, uh, Sweden, Finland? So this is the question, because Putin is not stopping in Ukraine. Ukraine is just a tiny piece of territory that he wants to return back to this neo USSR that he's trying to recreate, And recently we heard a disturbing message, I would say, from Russian Orthodox Church. We know that Russian Orthodox Church is basically let's say, an affiliated organization of the Russian FSB/KGB, and it's part of the Russian state apparatus that doesn't exist separate from the state in Russia. They basically part of the state. And recently they made a statement calling for the holy war against the West. And what they said, again, what the Russian Patriarch Kirill, former KGB spy, said, he said that Russia's interests don't don't end in Ukraine. Russia's interests are not limited to Ukraine only. So they were talking about returning back the former USSR territories, countries of Baltics, and they were also talking about possibly like future invasions. Again, according to the NATO experts, we know that Russia is possibly preparing for an invasion of European countries around 2026. These news were published broadly, I believe, last week. And Russians are preparing big time, because currently they also involved the church. We know that there's plenty of followers of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, in countries like Serbia, for example, and basically around Europe, in the US as well. There's more than 2,000 parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church. That's why the picture is very, very much disturbing.
And just finally, in terms of what we may see in the next few weeks and months, there is a lot of speculation of a potentially imminent Russian offensive. Are you worried about that? How seriously do you take that threat?
We take all the threats very, very seriously, and especially considering the fact that Russians are concentrating their troops, they will possibly attempt to strike Kharkiv. They will possibly attempt to take control over Dnipro. That is something they were talking about, and this is something that we have information on from our intelligence service. We are, of course, concerned about it because currently Russians have advantage in terms of aviation and artillery. Russians also have advantage in terms of initiative, unfortunately. That's why they can attack in any given direction and at any given span of the front line. So everything depends on our allies, everything depends on their ability to withstand the Russian informational warfare in the US and in Europe as well. And hopefully we will see more supplies coming to Ukraine, because if we compare for example, Ukrainian defense last year, when we had parity in terms of artillery, we had not in terms of numbers, but in terms of range and precision. So currently the situation is absolutely different, and there are times when we have to use one howitzer against 10 Russian howitzers, like it was in Rubizhne in 2022. Which is ridiculous. So we are expecting this support from our European allies until, before it's too late. Before it's too late.
Operator Starsky, always great to have you on Frontline. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio, and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.